When the famous Captain James Cook arrived at the Hawaiian, or Sandwich Islands as they were called at the time, he observed among the natives many of the same customs he had seen elsewhere in the South Seas, namely, human sacrifice and cannibalism. In the following quote, Captain Cook and company are observing the graves and morai, or temples, at the Hawaiian Islands. He goes on to talk about the human sacrifice customs of not just Hawaii, but throughout large portions of Polynesia. We had met already with so many striking instances of resemblance between the burying place we were now visiting and those of islands we had lately come from in the South Pacific, that we had little doubt in our minds that the resemblance existed also in the ceremonies practiced here, and particularly in the horrid one of offering human sacrifices. Our suspicions were too soon confirmed by direct evidence. For on coming out of the house, just on one side of the entrance, we saw a small square place, and another still less near it, and on asking what these were, our guide immediately informed us that in the one was buried a man who had been sacrificed. At a little distance from these, near the middle of the marae, were 3 more of these square enclosed places, with 2 pieces of carved wood at each, and upon them a heap of fern. These, we were told, were the graves of 3 chiefs, and before them was an oblong enclosed space, to which our conductor also gave the name of Tangatatabu, telling us so explicitly that we could not mistake his meaning, that 3 human sacrifices had been buried there, that is, one at the funeral of each chief. It was with most sincere concern that I could trace, on such undoubted evidence, the prevalence of these bloody rites throughout this immense ocean, amongst people disjoined by such a distance, and even ignorant of each other's existence, though so strongly marked as originally of the same nation. It was no small addition to this concern to reflect that every appearance led us to believe that the barbarous practice was very general here. The island seemed to abound with such places of sacrifice as this which we were now visiting, and which appeared to be one of the most inconsiderable of them, being far less conspicuous than several others which we had seen as we sailed along the coast, and particularly than that on the opposite side of the water in this valley. End quote. In the following quote, Captain Cook talks about the cannibalism of the Hawaiians as they were engaging in trade with them. One of our visitors on this occasion, who offered some fishhooks for sale, was observed to have a very small parcel to the string of one of them, which he separated with great care, and reserved for himself when he parted with the hook. Being asked what it was, he pointed to his belly and spoke something of its being dead, at the same time saying it was bad, as if he did not wish to answer any more questions about it. On seeing him so anxious to conceal the contents of this parcel, he was requested to open it, which he did with great reluctance, and some difficulty, as it was wrapped up in many folds of cloth. We found that it contained a thin bit of flesh about 2 inches long, which to appearance had been dried, but was now wet with salt water. It struck us that it might be human flesh, and that these people might, perhaps, eat their enemies, as we knew that this was the practice of some of the natives of the South Sea Islands. The question being put to the person who produced it, he answered that the flesh was part of a man. Another of his countrymen who stood by him was then asked whether it was their custom to eat those killed in battle. He immediately answered in the affirmative. End quote. Captain Cook was incredulous at first in reference to the Hawaiians' cannibalism. He describes another instance with the natives on the following day. Several canoes came off in the morning and followed us as we stood out to sea, bartering their roots and other articles. Being very averse to believe these people to be cannibals, notwithstanding the suspicious circumstance which had happened the day before, we took occasion now to make some more inquiries about this. A small wooden instrument beset with shark's teeth had been purchased, and from its resemblance to the saw or knife used by the New Zealanders to dissect the bodies of their enemies, it was suspected to have the same use here. One of the natives being asked about this immediately gave the name of the instrument, and told us that it was used to cut out the fleshy part of the belly when any person was killed. This explained and confirmed the circumstance above mentioned, of the person pointing to his belly. The man, however, from whom we had this information, being asked if his countrymen eat the part thus cut out, denied it strongly, but upon the question being repeated showed some degree of fear, and swam to his canoe. Just before Ho reached it, he made signs as he had done before, expressive of the use of the instrument. And an old man who sat foremost in the canoe, being then asked whether they eat the flesh, answered in the affirmative, and laughed seemingly at the simplicity of such a question. He affirmed the fact on being asked again, and also said that it was excellent food, or as he expressed it, savory eating.
End quote.
Still not completely satisfied for some reason, Cook further investigates and finally accepts that the native Hawaiians did in fact practice cannibalism. The following occurred at or near Oahu. These visitors furnished us with an opportunity of agitating again the curious inquiry whether they were cannibals, and the subject did not take its rise from any question of ours, but from a circumstance that seemed to remove all ambiguity. One of the islanders who wanted to get in at the gunroom port was refused, and at the same time asked whether if he should come in we would kill and eat him, accompanying this question with signs so expressive that there could be no doubt about his meaning. This gave a proper opening to retort the question as to this practice, and a person behind the other in the canoe who paid great attention to what was passing, immediately answered that if we were killed on shore they would certainly eat us. He spoke with so little emotion that it appeared plainly to be his meaning that they would not destroy us for that purpose, but that their eating us would be the consequence of our being at enmity with them. I have availed myself of Mr. Anderson's collections for the decision of this matter, and am sorry to say that I cannot see the least reason to hesitate in pronouncing it to be certain that the horrid banquet of human flesh is as much relished here, amidst plenty, as it is in New Zealand.
End quote.
James King was a Royal Navy officer on Captain Cook's third voyage. King describes a marae he observed that had the skulls of human sacrifice victims used for its ornamentation. It was a square, solid pile of stones, about 40 yards long, 20 broad, and 14 in height. The top was flat and well paved, and surrounded by a wooden rail, on which were fixed the skulls of the captives, sacrificed on the death of their chiefs.
End quote.
King here elaborates on the human sacrifice and cannibalism of Hawaii and Polynesia. Though the custom of eating the bodies of their enemies be not known by positive evidence to exist in any of the South Sea Islands except New Zealand, yet it is extremely probable that it was originally prevalent in them all. The sacrificing human victims, which seems evidently to be a relic of this horrid practice, still obtains universally amongst these islanders, and it is easy to conceive why the New Zealanders should retain the repast, which was probably the last act of these shocking rites, longer than the rest of their tribe, who were situated in more mild and fruitful climates. As the inhabitants of the Sandwich Islands certainly bear a nearer resemblance to those of New Zealand, both in their persons and dispositions, than to any other people of this family, so it was strongly suspected by Mr. Anderson that, like them, they still continue to feast on human flesh. But, as I always entertained great doubts of the justice of his conclusions, it may not be improper to take this occasion of mentioning the grounds on which I venture to differ from him. With respect to the information derived from the natives themselves, I shall only observe that great pains were taken by almost every officer on board to come at the knowledge of so curious a circumstance, and that, except in the 2 instances mentioned by Mr. Anderson, we found them invariably denying the existence of any such custom amongst them. It must be allowed that Mr. Anderson's knowledge of their language, which was superior to that of any other person in either ship, ought certainly to give his opinion great weight. At the same time, I must beg leave to remark that being present when he examined the man who had the small piece of salted flesh wrapped in cloth, it struck me very forcibly that the signs he made use of meant nothing more than that it was intended to be ate, and that it was very pleasant or wholesome to the stomach. In this opinion I was confirmed by a circumstance which came to our knowledge after the death of my worthy and ingenious friend, that almost every native of these islands carried about with him, either in his calabash or wrapped up in a piece of cloth, and tied about his waist, a small piece of raw pork, highly salted, which they considered as a great delicacy, and used now and then to taste of. The argument drawn from the instrument made with shark's teeth, and which is nearly of the same form with those used at New Zealand for cutting up the bodies of their enemies, is much more difficult to controvert. I believe it to be an undoubted fact that this knife, if it may be so called, is never used by them in cutting the flesh of other animals. However, as the custom of offering human sacrifices, and of burning the bodies of the slain, is still prevalent here, it is not improbable that the use of this instrument is retained in those ceremonies. Upon the whole, I am strongly inclined to think, and particularly from this last circumstance, that the horrid practice in question has but lately ceased amongst these and other islands of the South Sea. Omai, when pressed on this subject, confessed that in the rage and fury of revenge, they would sometimes tear the flesh of their enemies that were slain, with their teeth, but positively denied that they ever eat it. This was certainly approaching as near the fact as could be, but on the other hand, The denial is a strong proof that the practice has actually ceased, since in New Zealand, where it still exists, the inhabitants never made the smallest scruple of confessing it. Human sacrifices are more frequent here in Hawaii, according to the account of the natives themselves, than in any other islands we visited. These horrid rites are not only had recourse to upon the commencement of war and preceding great battles, and other signal enterprises, but the death of any considerable chief calls for a sacrifice of one or more totos, according to his rank, and we were told that 10 men were destined to suffer on the death of Teriobu. What may, if anything possibly can lessen, in some small degree, the horror of this practice, is that the unhappy victims have not the most distant intimation of their fate. Those who are fixed upon to fall are set upon with clubs wherever they happen to be, and after being dispatched, are brought dead to the place where the remainder of the rites are completed. The reader will here call to his remembrance the skulls of the captives that have been sacrificed at the death of some great chief, and which were fixed on the rails round the top of the marae at Kukua. We got a farther piece of intelligence upon this subject at the village of Kurowa, where on our inquiring into the use of a small piece of ground enclosed with a stone fence, we were told that it was a heria, or burying ground of a chief, and there, added our informer, pointing to one of the corners, lie the tangata and wahine tabu, or the man and woman who were sacrificed at his funeral. The chiefs are interred in the morai, or heries, with the men sacrificed on the occasion by the side of them.
End quote. Thanks for watching.